The late summer light came through the kitchen windows of number 12, grim old place in slanted rays, catching dust motes that drifted like memories through the quiet air. Creacher moved among them with the practiced efficiency of decades, his gnarled fingers wrapped around a silver teapot that had not been properly polished since before the war. He worked in silence. He had always worked in silence. The house settled around him with small creaks and sighs, the sounds of old wood and older magic adjusting to the stillness of a London evening. Upstairs, the portrait of Walburga Black slept behind her curtains, or pretended to sleep. Creacher suspected she was listening, even now, even after everything. She had always been listening. But Master Harry had asked him not to disturb her, and Creacher obeyed Master Harry. It was strange, still, to have a master who asked rather than commanded. Strange to have a master who looked uncomfortable with the very word. Strange to serve someone who had fought beside house elves, who had mourned one, who spoke Creacher's name as though it belonged to a person rather than a possession. The teapot gleamed under his cloth. Creacher set it aside and reached for the next piece. A serving tray engraved with the Black family crest. The silver was tarnished, nearly black, neglected through years of war and isolation and slow decay. He had been neglecting many things. The house had been full of shadows and secrets and rage for so long that the simple work of polishing had seemed almost beside the point. But the war was over now. Creacher did not quite know what to do with that knowledge. It sat in his chest like something heavy and undigested. The Dark Lord was gone. Master Regulus had been vindicated, his sacrifice recognized at last. The locket, that terrible, poisonous thing, had been destroyed. And yet, Creacher still woke each morning in his cupboard, still tended the kitchen fire, still polished silver for a family that had dwindled to almost nothing. The front door opened upstairs. Creature's ears, large and bat-like, swiveled toward the sound even as his hands continued their work. Footsteps on the stairs, young but heavy with tiredness. Creacher knew those footsteps. Creacher? Harry Potter's voice carried down into the kitchen, tentative in that particular way he had, as though he were never quite certain of his welcome in his own house. Creacher is in the kitchen, Master Harry, he called back, his voice a rasp that came from speaking too rarely and shouting too often over too many years. The footsteps descended. Harry appeared in the doorway, still thin despite the war's end, still wearing that expression of vague concern that seemed to have become permanent. He had his mother's eyes. Creacher had served the House of Black long enough to recognize the look of someone carrying more than they ought. "You don't have to call me that," Harry said, as he always did. "Creacher knows what Master Harry prefers," Creacher replied, as he always did. They observed each other for a moment, this peculiar pair bound together by history and magic, and the last wishes of better men than either of them had properly known. Then Harry seemed to shake himself slightly and crossed to the scarred wooden table that dominated the center of the kitchen. "I brought your post," he said, pulling a few letters from his jacket pocket. "Most of it's for me, but there's something here from Gringotts about the estate." Creacher nodded. He did not reach for the letters. Post was for masters, not house elves, though Master Harry had tried more than once to insist otherwise. Instead, he continued polishing the tray, working the cloth into the intricate scrollwork of the family crest. Harry watched him for a moment, then pulled out a chair and sat down with the particular heaviness of someone who had been standing for too long. "Hermione's been asking after you," he said. Creature's hand stilled, just for a heartbeat. "Miss Granger is well. She's working at the Ministry now, Department for the Regulation and Control of Magical Creatures." Harry's tone was carefully neutral. "She's trying to change things, for house elves." Creature resumed his polishing. "Creature has heard. She wants to talk to you, if you're willing." About what Master Harry is telling Creature already, Creature is thinking. "Yeah." Harry ran a hand through his perpetually untidy hair. "Look, Creature, I know you and Hermione haven't exactly... after the whole SPEW thing and everything, I know she was..." "Miss Granger is young," Creature said, surprising himself. "She is meaning well." Harry blinked. It was possibly the kindest thing Creature had ever said about Hermione Granger. The silence that followed was more comfortable than such silences usually were. Outside, London continued its evening routine. Distant traffic, the call of birds settling for the night, the particular quality of sound that came with summer edging toward autumn. Inside, the kitchen fire popped softly, and the enchanted lamps began to glow a little brighter as the natural light faded. Harry cleared his throat. "I also wanted to talk to you about something." Creature waited. "You're free now," Harry said, the words coming in a rush as though he'd been practicing them. "You've always been free technically, since I inherited you from Sirius, but I wanted you to know that you can leave. If you want, I can give you clothes, proper wages, whatever you need. You don't have to stay here." The tray gleamed in Creature's hands, the black family crest restored to its former glory. He set it down gently among its fellows, and finally turned to face his master fully. "Master Harry is very kind," he said quietly. "I'm not trying to get rid of you," Harry said quickly. "I just want you to have a choice. You've spent your whole life serving people who weren't..." He stopped, clearly, struggling. "You deserve better than this." "This is the House of Black," Creature said. "Creature is a black house elf. Creature is serving the House of Black." "I'm not really. I'm Harry Potter, not Harry Black. I don't even..." "Master Harry is carrying the blood of the House of Black through his grandmother," Creature said, with the firmness of someone reciting genealogy that had been drilled into him since birth. "Master Harry is being the last of the line of Black through Master Sirius. Master Harry is being Creature's master." Harry looked pained. "But you should have a choice. Creature is choosing to stay." They regarded each other across the kitchen table, master and house elf, neither quite understanding the other, but both trying, which was perhaps more than most had managed over the long, fraught history between wizards and those who served them. Finally, Harry nodded slowly. "All right, but the offer stands. Always." "Master Harry is kind," Creature repeated, and meant it. After Harry left, declining dinner with an apologetic excuse about meeting Ron and Hermione, Creature returned to his work. But his mind wandered as his hands moved, pulled back through the years to another master, another time. Master Regulus had been kind too in his way. Creature had served him from the time Master Regulus was a small boy, had watched him grow from a child desperate for his parents' approval into a young man who had made terrible choices for what he believed were the right reasons. And in the end, Master Regulus had done something extraordinary. He had seen Creature. not as a servant, not as a creature, not as a tool to be used and discarded, but as someone worthy of being saved. The memory of that cave still woke Creacher sometimes in the darkest hours of the night. The water, the inferi, Master Regulus's face as he ordered Creacher to leave him, to take the locket, to destroy it. The weight of that command had sat on Creacher for years, like a stone on his chest, growing heavier with each passing day that he failed to fulfill it. But it was done now. The locket was destroyed. Master Regulus's sacrifice had not been in vain. Creacher moved through the kitchen, banking the fire for the night, setting the polished silver carefully in its proper places. His hands knew these tasks so well that he barely needed to think about them, which left his mind free to wander where it would. He found himself at the pantry, reaching behind the flour sacks where he kept his few personal possessions. A scrubbing brush that had been Master Regulus's first gift to him, a photograph of the Black family in better days, and a small wooden box. The box was old, its hinges stiff. Creacher had not opened it in months. Inside, wrapped in cloth, was a letter. He had found it 3 days ago, quite by accident. The kitchen had needed new shelving, and when Creacher had pulled away the old boards, there behind them, tucked into a gap in the stone wall, had been an envelope, his name on it, in Master Regulus's handwriting. Creacher carried it to the table and sat down slowly, his old bones creaking. He had read the letter a dozen times already, but he unfolded it now with the same careful reverence he had shown the first time, as though the paper might crumble to dust if handled roughly. Creacher, if you are reading this, then I have failed to return from the task I have set myself. I am sorry for that, not for the task itself, which I believe to be necessary, but for leaving you alone. You have been more faithful than I deserved. I want you to know that what I have learned about the Dark Lord's magic has taught me something else as well. I have seen what he does to those who serve him. I have seen what all of us do, we who call ourselves masters. There is work yet to be done, Creacher. Not just the locket. I hope you will find a way to destroy it, though I know I could not. But other work. The house elf question, as Mother called it, as though you were a question rather than a person. I do not know how to change things. Perhaps it cannot be changed, but I find I cannot stop thinking that it should be. If I do not return, tend the house as you see fit. You have always known better than the rest of us what it needed. You're a good friend, Creacher. Perhaps my only real one. I'm sorry I did not say so when I could have. Regulus Arcturus. Black Creature's eyes, old and roomy, blurred slightly as he read. His fingers trembled on the paper. Creacher is not understanding Master Regulus, he whispered to the empty kitchen. Creacher is not knowing what Master Regulus is wanting Creacher to do. The fire popped. The house creaked. Outside, night had fallen completely, and Grimmauld Place was just another shadow among shadows in the London dark. Creacher folded the letter carefully and returned it to its box, returned the box to its hiding place. Then he stood in his kitchen, and it was his kitchen, truly, more than it had ever been anyone else's, and felt the weight of unfinished work settling onto his narrow shoulders. Master Regulus had died believing that house elves deserved something better than they had been given. He had died believing it strongly enough to write it down, to leave it as a final task for the one servant who had truly loved him, and Creacher, who had spent his entire long life in service to the House of Black, who had polished silver and scrubbed floors and endured the screaming of portraits and the cruelty of masters both casual and deliberate, found himself thinking of Miss Granger, young, meaning well, trying to change things. Perhaps the way to honor Master Regulus was not simply to remember his sacrifice, but to finish what he had hoped to begin. The thought frightened Creacher. He was old. He was set in his ways. He knew how the world worked, knew his place in it. Change was for young wizards and foolish ones, for those who did not understand that some things simply were as they had always been. But Master Regulus had been young too, and he had changed. Creacher stood alone in his kitchen, surrounded by polished silver and old magic and the ghosts of every Black who had ever lived in this house, and felt something shift inside his chest. Not hope exactly. Hope was too bright a word for what moved in him, but perhaps possibility. Outside, summer was ending. Inside, something else was beginning. Creacher extinguished the lamps one by one, leaving only the fire to glow softly in the hearth, and went to his cupboard to sleep. Tomorrow he would tend the house as he always had. But perhaps tomorrow he might also write a letter of his own, to Miss Granger, to the young witch who meant well and who was trying, in her fierce and clumsy way, to change the world. Master Regulus would have wanted that, Creacher thought. And for the first time in many years, the thought of what Master Regulus would have wanted did not bring only grief. It brought something else, a beginning. The Ministry of Magic in early autumn had a particular quality to it, a sense of determined renewal that hung in the air like the smell of fresh parchment and furniture polish. Hermione Granger sat at her desk on the second floor, surrounded by stacks of files that threatened to topple at any moment, and tried not to feel overwhelmed. Her office was small, very small, barely large enough for the desk, 2 chairs, and a filing cabinet that didn't quite close properly. The nameplate outside read, H. Granger, Junior Assistant to the Deputy Head, Department for the Regulation and Control of Magical Creatures, which was an impressively long title for someone whose primary job seemed to be filing reports that no one would ever read. But it was a start. Through the narrow window, she could see a slice of London sky, grey and promising rain. The ministry was rebuilding itself, slowly and sometimes painfully. And Hermione had been determined to be part of that rebuilding. She had turned down offers to finish her Hogwarts education. She could do that later, she'd insisted, in favor of this cramped office and this impossible task. House elf rights. The words sat in her mind with all the complexity they had acquired over 7 years of magical education, friendship with Harry, and a war that had taught her that good intentions were not always the same as good outcomes. She pulled another file toward her, a report on house elf populations in wizarding households dated 1973. The language made her wince, clinical, detached, as though they were discussing livestock rather than sentient beings. She had been reading files like this for 3 weeks now, and each one left her feeling more frustrated and more certain that she was in exactly the right place, doing exactly the right work, no matter how small her office or how junior her position. A soft pop interrupted her thoughts. Hermione looked up, startled. House elves could apparate within the ministry, but they rarely came to individual offices unless summoned. She had certainly not summoned anyone. Creacher stood before her desk. He looked the same as he always had, ancient, wrinkled, draped in a tea towel that might once have been white, but had faded to an indeterminate grey. His enormous eyes, rheumy and suspicious, fixed on her with an expression she couldn't quite read. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. "Creature," Hermione said finally, carefully setting down her quill. "This is unexpected." "Miss Granger is working," Creacher observed, his voice that particular rasp she remembered from Grimmauld Place. "Yes, I am." She gestured slightly at the chaos surrounding her. "Did Harry send you?" "Master Harry is not sending Creacher. Creacher is coming himself." This was surprising enough that Hermione simply stared. In all the years she had known Creacher, if known was the right word for their thorny, complicated acquaintance, he had never sought her out, voluntarily. Quite the opposite, in fact. "I see," she said slowly. "Would you like to sit down?" Creature's eyes narrowed slightly, as though suspicious of the offer, but after a moment he moved to the second chair. He did not sit so much as perch on its edge, ready to flee at any moment. Hermione waited. She had learned, over the years, that silence was sometimes more effective than questions. Let people, or house elves, come to things in their own time. "Miss Granger is trying to change things for house elves," Creacher said eventually. "I am." Hermione kept her voice level, neutral. "I'm trying to establish protections, rights, better conditions." "Miss Granger is thinking house elves is wanting to be free." It wasn't quite a question, but Hermione heard the challenge in it. This was familiar ground, well worn from her SPEW days. But she was older now. She had learned some things. "I think house elves should have the choice to be free," she said carefully. "I think they should have the right to wages, to safe working conditions, to leave an abusive master. I don't think anyone should be owned." Creature's expression remained unreadable. Miss Granger is not understanding house elves. Once, that statement would have made her bristle, would have launched her into an impassioned defense of her position. But Hermione had learned to listen even when, especially when, it was uncomfortable. "You're probably right," she said quietly. "I'm trying to understand. But I'm also not willing to accept that things should stay as they are just because they've always been that way." Something flickered across Creature's face. He reached into the folds of his tea towel and withdrew a letter, creased and worn from much handling. He held it for a moment, as though reluctant to let it go, then placed it on the desk between them. "Master Regulus is writing this," he said, "before he is dying." Hermione's breath caught. She had heard the story, of course. How Regulus, Black had turned against Voldemort, how he had discovered the Horcrux, how he had sacrificed himself to protect Creacher. But she had never expected to see his words. "May I?" she asked, not reaching for the letter yet. Creacher nodded, a sharp jerk of his head. The parchment was old, the ink faded but still legible. Hermione read slowly, aware of Creature's eyes on her face, aware that this was a kind of test. The letter was brief, but devastating in its simplicity. A young man facing death, acknowledging his house elf not as property, but as a friend. And there, in the middle, that striking phrase, the house elf question, as Mother called it, as though you were a question rather than a person. Hermione's hands trembled slightly as she finished reading. She set the letter down with great care. "He saw you," she said softly. "Really saw you. Master Regulus is dying so Creacher could live. Creacher said, his voice rougher than usual. Master Regulus is thinking things should be changing for house elves. Master Regulus is not knowing how. But you think I might? Creacher is thinking Miss Granger is trying very hard. Creacher is thinking Miss Granger is not always right, but is not always wrong either. He paused, and when he spoke again, his tone had shifted slightly. Creacher is knowing things about pure-blood families, about how house elves is being bound, about old magic and old contracts, things Miss Granger is not finding in files. Hermione leaned forward, careful to keep her excitement in check. You want to help me? Creacher is wanting to honor Master Regulus, he corrected. Master Regulus is saying there is work to be done. Creacher is thinking, perhaps this is the work. It was not quite an alliance, not yet, but it was something neither of them had expected, and Hermione felt the significance of it settle into the small office like a weight and a gift. I would be grateful for your help, she said formally, and I promise to listen. Really. Listen, even when, especially when, you tell me I'm wrong. Creacher regarded her for a long moment. Then, with the air of someone making a momentous decision, he gave a single nod. Miss Granger is having tea? He asked. Hermione blinked at the non sequitur. No, actually, I've been meaning to get some, but another soft pop, and a tea service appeared on the corner of her desk. Not elaborate, but serviceable. A pot, 2 cups, a small jug of milk. The tea was already steaming. Creacher is thinking better conversations is happening with tea, he said, almost primly. Despite everything, the seriousness of the moment, the weight of what they were beginning, Hermione smiled. You might be right about that. She poured for both of them, and Creacher accepted his cup with a dignity that reminded her, suddenly and powerfully, that he had spent his entire long life in service to one of the oldest pure-blood families in Britain. He knew things about wizarding society that she, muggle-born and self-taught, could only guess at. Tell me about the bindings, she said, once they had both taken a sip. The magical contracts you mentioned. Creacher set down his cup with care. Pure-blood families is keeping records, very old records. How house elves is being bound to families, how magic is being sealed, what is being owed, and what is being given. Like the tapestry at Grimmauld Place, the family tree. Similar, but more. Records of oaths, of promises, of magics performed. He paused. Most families is thinking house elves is not being able to read these records, but Creacher is learning many years ago. Master Regulus is teaching Creacher to read. Hermione's grip tightened on her teacup. So you can access information that most people assume doesn't exist or can't be understood. Creacher is accessing many things. Creacher is knowing which families is treating house elves well, which is treating them poorly. Creacher is knowing which contracts is having flexibility, which is being absolute. And you'd be willing to share this to help me understand how the system actually works, not just how the ministry thinks it works. Creacher's expression was solemn. Creacher is having one condition. What is it? Miss Granger is promising not to be deciding what is best for house elves without asking house elves first. Miss Granger is promising to listen. It was a fair condition. More than fair. It was, Hermione realized, with a flush of shame, exactly what she should have done from the very beginning years ago when she had started SPEW with such righteous certainty. I promise, she said. Creacher, I promise. I'll listen. I'll ask. I won't assume I know better than the people I'm trying to help." He studied her face for a long moment, as though assessing her sincerity. Then he nodded again. "Then Creacher is helping Miss Granger with her work." They sat in silence for a moment, drinking their tea while the ministry bustled on around, them unaware that in this tiny office something significant had just begun. Outside, the promised rain began to fall, pattering softly against the window. "There is something else," Creacher said eventually. "Something Creacher is finding in Master Regulus's papers." "What is it?" "Master Regulus is researching Horcruxes before he is dying. Creacher is telling Master Harry this already. But there is being more. Master Regulus is trying to understand the magic of soulbinding, how the Dark Lord is doing it. Why?" Hermione set down her cup. "And Master Regulus is writing that the Dark Lord is interested in house elf magic, that house elves is binding themselves to families but is keeping their souls whole, that this is puzzling the Dark Lord." Creature's voice dropped lower. "Master Regulus is thinking the Dark Lord is never understanding loyalty, never understanding how someone is choosing to serve without being broken." "Where are these papers now?" "Some is being at Grimmauld Place, but Creature is thinking some is being hidden elsewhere. Master Regulus is paranoid at the end, frightened, hiding things in different places. Do you know where? Creature is having suspicions. The Lestrange vaults, perhaps. Other Black family properties. Places Master Regulus is having access to." Hermione's mind was already racing ahead, thinking of possibilities, of what such research might reveal, of how it might help in understanding not just Horcruxes, but the fundamental nature of magical binding and choice and will. "We should look," she said, "when we can, carefully. Miss Granger is understanding this is being dangerous, that dark magic is not being kind to those who is studying it." "I understand. But if your Master Regulus thought it was important enough to research, important enough to hide, then it's important enough to find." Creature inclined his head, acknowledgement, if not quite agreement. They finished their tea in companionable silence, and Hermione found herself thinking about Dobby, about how he had died to save them, how he had chosen loyalty and friendship over safety, about how she had never fully understood him, even at the end. "Creature," she said softly, "I knew a house elf named Dobby. He was a friend of Harry's. He died during the war." Creature is knowing of Dobby, a strange elf, wanting clothes and wages and freedom. But there was something in Creature's tone that wasn't quite contempt. Almost, Hermione thought, it might have been respect. "He was brave," Hermione said. "Very brave." "House elves is often being brave," Creature said. "Wizards is just not noticing." It was a rebuke, gentle but firm, and Hermione accepted it with a nod. "I'll do better," she said. "I'll notice, and I'll make sure others notice too." Creature stood, straightening his tea towel with dignity. "Creature is returning to Grimmauld Place now. Master Harry is wanting dinner prepared, but Creature is coming back if Miss Granger is agreeable." "Very agreeable. Thank you, Creature, for coming, for trusting me." He regarded her with those enormous eyes, ancient and knowing. Creature is not trusting yet, not entirely, but Creature is willing to try. For Master Regulus. "For Dobby," Hermione said quietly. Their eyes met, house elf and witch, separated by everything and connected by loss and the strange, stubborn hope that things might be better than they had been. For them both, Creacher agreed. And then he was gone, vanished with a soft pop that left only the faint smell of magic and the tea service on her desk. Hermione sat for a long time after he left, watching the rain run down her window and thinking about beginnings, about how they were rarely grand or obvious, how sometimes they were just an old house elf and a young witch sharing tea in a cramped office, deciding to try. She pulled a fresh piece of parchment toward her and began to write, organizing her thoughts, preparing questions for Creacher's next visit. The files could wait. This unlikely partnership, this fragile alliance, this was the real work. Outside, the rain fell steadily, washing the ministry clean, and autumn settled more deeply over London. Inside, Hermione Granger smiled and kept writing. The library at Grimmauld Place had always felt like a tomb to Hermione. All dark wood and darker histories, the air thick with dust, and the particular mustiness that came from books left undisturbed for decades. But on this late autumn evening, with candles floating at intervals throughout the room and a fire crackling in the grate, it felt almost welcoming. Almost. She sat at the heavy oak table that dominated the center of the room, surrounded by stacks of leather-bound volumes that Creacher had pulled from the shelves with surprising reverence. The Black family records, he had called them, chronicles of births and deaths, marriages and scandals, properties acquired and fortunes spent, and woven through it all, in margins and footnotes, and sometimes in careful appendices, references to the house elves who had served the family through the centuries. Creacher moved through the room like a shadow, pulling down another volume, replacing one they had finished with, adjusting the position of a candle so the light fell better across the pages. He had been doing this for the past hour, methodical and patient, and Hermione had learned not to rush him. The house elf had his own system, his own understanding of these records that went far deeper than alphabetical order or chronological arrangement. This one, Creacher said, finally, placing a particularly ancient-looking tome before her, is having the earliest binding records, from when the Blacks is first becoming prominent. Hermione opened it carefully, aware that the parchment was fragile with age. The handwriting was archaic, the language formal in a way that made translation slow. But there, on the third page, she found what Creacher had promised, a detailed account of how the Black family had bound their first house elf into service. It was not pleasant reading. "It's a contract," she said slowly, tracing the words with one finger, careful not to touch the actual ink, but not one the house elf agreed to. "House elves is never agreeing," Creacher said from somewhere behind her. "Is being bound by the family's magic, not by choice. Is being the way of things for always. But it doesn't have to be. Miss Granger is saying this, but old magic is being very strong, very old." He appeared at her elbow, looking down at the page with an expression she couldn't quite read. "This elf is being called Morven, is serving the Blacks for 63 years before dying, is having no choice in serving, is having no choice in staying, is being bound until death." Hermione felt the familiar anger rising in her chest, but she pushed it down. Anger was easy. Understanding was harder and more useful. "Are all the bindings the same?" she asked. "Or are there variations? Is being variations?" Creacher pulled another book toward them, opening it to a marked page. "Some families is binding absolutely. House Elf is being unable to disobey even slightly. But some families... He paused, his gnarled finger hovering over a passage. Some is leaving small spaces, small freedoms, is still binding, but is being less tight. Hermione leaned closer, reading the passage he had indicated. It was from the late 17th century, a contract between the Black family and a house elf named Wilfric. And there, buried in the formal language, was a clause she had not expected. The elf shall serve faithfully in all matters pertaining to the household, but may exercise judgment in the execution of duties as befits the family's honor. That's different, she said, looking up at Creacher. That's giving the house elf some autonomy, some ability to make decisions. Is being rare, Creacher said, but is existing. Some masters is understanding that house elf who is thinking for himself is being more useful than the house elf who is only obeying. And these contracts, they're magical, binding in the literal sense, is being sealed with family magic, blood magic, old magic, is why house elves is being unable to break binding even when wanting to. Creature's voice was matter-of-fact, but Hermione heard the weight beneath it. Is being the chain Miss Granger is wanting to break. She sat back, thinking. The fire popped softly, and somewhere in the house a portrait murmured in its sleep. Rain had begun again outside, a steady patter against the windows that made the library feel even more like a refuge from the world. "What about Regulus's research?" she asked. "You said he was studying soul-binding magic. Is that connected to this?" Creature was quiet for a long moment. Then he crossed to a locked cabinet in the corner of the room and withdrew a small wooden box, warded with charms that Hermione could feel even from across the room. He brought it to the table and opened it with a word spoken too softly for her to hear. Inside were loose pages, covered in handwriting that was younger, more hurried than the formal scripts in the family records. Regulus's hand, she realized. These were his personal notes. "Master Regulus is becoming curious," Creature said, his voice soft with memory. "Is wanting to understand how the Dark Lord is splitting his soul, is reading everything he can find about Horcruxes, about dark magic, about binding spells, and is discovering something." He spread the pages carefully across the table. Hermione pulled the nearest candle closer and began to read. The notes were fragmentary, sometimes difficult to follow, the thoughts of a young man working through complex magical theory under considerable stress. But as she read, a picture began to emerge. Regulus had been trying to understand how Voldemort could split his soul and still function, still think, still work magic, and in his research, he had stumbled across references to house elf magic, how elves bound themselves to families, how they gave service and loyalty without losing themselves in the process. The Dark Lord sees house elves as lesser beings, Regulus had written in a margin. But their magic is something he cannot replicate. They bind themselves completely to service, yet remain whole. A Horcrux is the opposite, a piece of soul torn away, diminished. He fractures while they remain integrated. Why? And then, several pages later, Mother calls it the house elf question, as though they are a problem to be solved rather than people to be understood. But understanding them might be the key to understanding what the Dark Lord has done wrong. He knows nothing of loyalty, nothing of chosen service. He can only compel and destroy. Hermione's hands trembled slightly as she read. He was trying to understand the difference between slavery and loyalty, Master Regulus is thinking house elves, is knowing something the Dark Lord never could, Creacher said quietly, is thinking we is being stronger than wizards, is understanding, because we is keeping our souls whole, even while being bound, because you choose to serve, Hermione said slowly, working through the idea. Even when you're compelled to serve, somewhere deep down, there's still a choice being made, to be loyal, to care, to remain yourself. Creature is not knowing if this is being true for all house elves, but is being true for Creacher. He touched the pages gently, reverently. Master Regulus is seeing this, is seeing Creacher, not just house elf, is asking Creacher to choose to help him, even though Creacher is being bound to obey. And Creacher is choosing. The implications settled over Hermione like a weight. If Regulus was right, if house elf magic contained some principle that kept the soul intact even under binding, then understanding that magic might not only help with house elf rights, but might reveal something fundamental about the nature of magical compulsion and choice. Are there more notes? She asked. More research? Is being more, Creature is thinking. But Master Regulus is hiding things, is paranoid at the end, is frightened of being discovered, is putting papers in different places. Creature hesitated. Creature is thinking some is being in the Lestrange vaults. The Lestrange vaults. Hermione looked up sharply. At Gringotts. Master Regulus is being related to the Lestranges through his mother, is having access sometimes to family properties, is using this access before he is dying. Creature's expression was troubled. But the vaults is being dangerous, is being cursed, is being full of dark objects. And after the war, after Bellatrix is dying, is being sealed by the Ministry. Hermione's mind raced. But they must have cleared the vaults, searched for dark objects, cursed items. The Ministry would have gone through everything. Ministry is looking for weapons, Creature said with something that might have been disdain. Is looking for cursed gold and dangerous artifacts, is not looking for research papers hidden in boxes and protected with spells that is looking like other spells. You think the papers are still there? Creature is thinking is possible. Master Regulus is being very clever about hiding things, is making protective spells that is looking like curses, is making important things look unimportant. The fire crackled, sending shadows dancing across the walls of books. Hermione thought about the implications, about what might be gained and what might be risked. The Lestrange vaults would still be dangerous, even cleared. Dark magic lingered. And if they were caught searching for things the Ministry had deemed worthless, we'd need permission, she said slowly. Official clearance. I'm not breaking into Gringotts. Miss Granger is working at the Ministry, Creature pointed out. Is being junior assistant, yes, but is still having Ministry credentials. Perhaps is being able to request access for research purposes. It was possible, unlikely, but possible. And if she framed it correctly, as research into dark magic artifacts, into understanding protective spells, into documenting the full extent of Death Eater activities. It would take time, she said. Paperwork, approvals, and we'd have to be careful, very careful. Creature is being patient. Is being patient for many years already. Can be patient longer. Hermione nodded slowly, her mind already working through the steps they would need to take. But something else was nagging at her. Something in the research notes she had just read. Creature, she said, looking up at him, what Master Regulus wrote about house elves keeping their souls whole while being bound. Do you agree with him? Do you think that's true? The old house elf was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. When he spoke, his voice was softer than she had ever heard it. Creature is not knowing about all house elves, but Creature is knowing about Creature. And yes, even in worse times, even when Mistress is screaming and Master is cruel and work is being endless, Creature is still being Creature, is still being able to remember Master Regulus with love, is still being able to choose in heart what is being right. That's what we need to protect, Hermione said fiercely. Not just freedom from abuse, but the recognition that you're whole, that you've always been whole, that being bound doesn't make you less than what you are. Creature met her eyes, and for the first time since he had appeared in her office, she saw something that might have been trust. Miss Granger is understanding more than she is understanding before, he said. I'm trying. She looked down at the scattered pages, at centuries of history and servitude and complicated loyalties. I'm really trying. They worked in silence for a while after that, going through the family, records, making notes, tracing the variations in binding spells across generations. Creature pointed out patterns she would have missed, explained nuances of magical contracts that no textbook had ever covered, and slowly, painstakingly, a picture emerged of a system that was neither as simple as she had once believed, nor as immutable as others claimed. There were cracks, small freedoms embedded in some contracts, variations that suggested some families had, at least occasionally, considered their house elves as more than property. It wasn't much, but it was something. Hours passed. The candles burned lower, the fire reduced to embers, and still they worked, witch and house elf, bent over ancient books in a library that had witnessed centuries of black family history. Finally, Hermione sat back, rubbing her eyes. We should stop for tonight. It's late. Creature looked up from the volume he had been examining. Miss Granger is being tired. Yes, but this... She gestured at the table, at the books and notes and half-formed theories. This is important, Creature. This is exactly what we needed. It's being only beginning, he said. Is being much more work ahead. I know, but it's a good beginning. She stood, stretching muscles that had stiffened from sitting too long. Thank you for sharing this, for trusting me with it. Creature began gathering the books with careful hands, preparing to return them to their places. Creature is having one more thing to show Miss Granger before she is leaving. He crossed to the far wall and pulled down a slim volume that had been shelved separately from the others. When he opened it, Hermione saw that it was not a book at all, but a collection of loose pages bound together, protected by preservation charms, sketches, dozens of them. Master Regulus is drawing sometimes, Creature said softly. Is not being very good at drawing, but is trying. Hermione looked through the pages. Rough sketches of Hogwarts, of the Black, family crest, of London streets. And then, near the end, a drawing that made her breath catch. A house elf standing straight and proud. No tea towel, but simple robes. No hunched shoulders, but dignity. And beneath it, in Regulus's handwriting, as they should be. He dreamed of this, Hermione whispered. He really did. Master Regulus is dreaming many things he is never living to see, Creature said, is why Creature must see them for him. Hermione touched the sketch gently, reverently. "We will. I promise you, Creature. We'll make this real." In the dying firelight, surrounded by the weight of history and the promise of change, they stood together, an unlikely partnership bound not by magic or compulsion, but by choice, by loyalty to those they had lost, by hope for what might yet be. Outside, the rain continued its steady rhythm, washing clean the London night. And inside, Grimmauld Place, in a library full of secrets, something old began, very slowly, to transform into something new. Winter had settled over Hogwarts like a familiar blanket, transforming the castle grounds into something from a snow globe. Hermione stood at the entrance to the kitchens, her hand hovering over the pair in the portrait, and felt an unexpected nervousness flutter in her chest. She'd been here before, of course, many times during her school years, usually to liberate house elves who hadn't particularly wanted liberating. The memory made her wince slightly. She had meant well. She always meant well. But meaning well and doing well were not always the same thing. Beside her, Creacher waited with his usual patient stillness. He had not been back to Hogwarts since before the war, and Hermione wondered what memories stirred in him as he looked at the familiar portrait. "Ready?" she asked softly. Creacher nodded once, and Hermione tickled the pair. The portrait swung open, and they stepped through into warmth and light and the overwhelming smell of baking bread. The Hogwarts kitchens were exactly as Hermione remembered. Enormous copper pots hanging from the ceiling, 4 long tables corresponding to the house tables above, ovens that never seemed to cool, and everywhere the quiet industry of house elves at work. The effect of their entrance was immediate. Work didn't stop. House elves were too well trained for that. But Hermione saw heads turn, enormous eyes widen. Several elves froze mid-task, staring at Creacher with something that looked like recognition mixed with uncertainty. An older elf, female, with a tea towel embroidered with the Hogwarts crest, approached them. Her expression was wary but polite. "Mrs. Visiting," she said, not quite a question. "Hello," Hermione said, keeping her voice gentle. "I'm Hermione Granger. I work at the Ministry now, in the Department for the Regulation and Control of Magical Creatures. I was hoping I might speak with some of you, if that would be all right." The house elf's eyes flickered to Creacher, and something shifted in her expression. "This is Creacher," Hermione added, "of the House of Black. He's helping me with some research." "Creacher is being known to Hogwarts elves," the female elf said, and there was definite respect in her tone now. "Creacher is being from a very old family, very old service." Creacher inclined his head, a gesture of acknowledgement between equals that Hermione had never quite seen from him before. "Creacher is remembering Hogwarts kitchens," he said. "Is visiting sometimes with Master Regulus many years ago, before Master Regulus is leaving school." "Then Creacher is welcome," the elf said firmly, "and Miss Granger is welcome also. I is being Polly. I is being head of the Hogwarts kitchen elves now that—" She hesitated, and Hermione saw sadness cross her face. "Now that Dobby is gone." The name hung in the warm air of the kitchen like a benediction and a wound. Several other elves had drawn closer now, curiosity overcoming caution, and at the mention of Dobby, Hermione saw them exchange glances. "Dobby was very brave," Hermione said quietly. "He saved my life. Saved all of us, really." "Dobby is being strange," said a younger elf, his voice not quite disapproving but uncertain. is wanting wages, is wearing so many clothes, but is being brave, yes, very brave. Is being free, another elf added, and the word fell into the conversation like a stone into still water. Polly gestured toward a small table near one of the ovens, away from the main work area. Miss Granger is sitting. Creature is sitting. We is bringing tea and is talking, if Miss is wanting. They settled at the table, and within moments, a proper tea service appeared. Not conjured, but carried over by a small elf who couldn't have been more than a few years into service. The pot was steaming, the cups were clean, and there were fresh scones that smelled of butter and currants. Hermione accepted the tea with genuine gratitude and noticed that Polly poured for Creacher with the same care she had shown for Hermione. Around them, the work of the kitchen continued, but she could feel the attention on them, house elves listening while appearing not to. I wanted to ask you about your work here, Hermione began, choosing her words carefully. About how you're treated, what conditions are like. Not to criticize, she added quickly, seeing Polly's expression shift, but to understand. I'm trying to write new legislation, new protections for house elves, and I've learned that I can't do that properly without listening first. It was Creature who spoke next, surprising her. Miss Granger is meaning well, but is not always understanding house elves, is learning now, is listening now, is why Creature is agreeing to help her. The endorsement, coming from Creature, seemed to carry weight. Polly relaxed slightly, her grip on her own teacup loosening. Hogwarts is being a good place to work, she said slowly. The castle is treating us well. The headmistress, Professor McGonagall now, is being fair and kind. We is getting plenty of food, warm places to sleep, healing when we is needing it. But, Hermione prompted gently. Polly hesitated. But sometimes, we's being invisible. Students is walking through kitchens and is not seeing us, not really. Is being expected always. The work, the service, is never being questioned if we is wanting something different. Does you want something different? Hermione asked. The question seemed to stump Polly. She looked around the kitchen at the familiar workspace, at the other elves moving through their tasks with practiced efficiency. Polly is not knowing, is being happy here, is liking the work, is taking pride in feeding students well. But sometimes, she trailed off. Sometimes is wondering what else there might be, finished another elf who had drifted closer. She was younger, her tea towel embroidered with what looked like self-done stitches. Imperfect, but charming. I is being Winky. Hermione's breath caught. Winky, I remember you. From the Crouch household. And then Hogwarts, Winky said, her voice steadier than Hermione remembered from those awful days after she had been freed. Winky is being very sad for a long time after Master Crouch is dismissing her, is being lost, is drinking butterbeer, and is being miserable. But you're better now? Hermione asked hopefully. Is being better, Winky confirmed. Is taking time, is taking much time. But Winky is finding purpose again here, is working, is being useful. But Winky is never forgetting what it is feeling like to be free and not wanting to be free, is being very confusing. Creature made a soft sound that might have been agreement. Is being complicated, he said. Freedom is not being simple thing. Some house elves is wanting it, some is not. Some is not knowing what they is wanting. That's what I'm trying to understand, Hermione said. I used to think freedom was the answer, Just free all house elves and everything would be better. But it's not that simple, is it? Miss Granger is learning, Polly said, and there was approval in her voice now. Is being about choice, not freedom. Is being about respect, about being seen. They talked for over an hour, the conversation flowing like the tea that kept appearing in their cups. Other elves joined them, some staying only briefly, others settling in to share their thoughts. Hermione heard stories of kindness and of cruelty, of masters who had been fair and others who had been monstrous. She heard about the pride house elves took in their work, about the magic that sustained them, about the complicated relationship between service and identity. And she listened, really listened, not planning her response or formulating arguments, but simply taking in what they were telling her. Creacher spoke rarely, but when he did, the other elves listened with particular attention. He told them about Regulus, about the cave, about the choice he had made to try to honor his master's last wishes even when it had seemed impossible. He spoke about the Black family, about serving through generations, about the weight of history and tradition. But tradition is not always being right, he said quietly. Creacher is learning this. It's hard to learn after so many years, but Master Regulus is seeing what was wrong, is trying to change things, and now Creacher must try also. A very young elf, no bigger than a large cat, crept closer to the table. Is it being scary? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Changing things. Creacher regarded her with his enormous eyes. Is being very scary, but is being right. And sometimes doing what is right is being more important than not being scared. The young elf nodded solemnly and scurried back to her work, but Hermione saw the thoughtful expression on her face. As the afternoon wore on, Hermione became aware of the rhythms of the kitchen, the way elves moved around each other with unconscious coordination, the pride they took in perfectly risen bread and flawlessly seasoned soup, the quiet satisfaction in work done well. This was what she had never understood before. That service itself was not the problem. The problem was when service became slavery, when pride became compulsion, when loyalty was demanded rather than given. What would help? She asked finally, as the winter light began to fade beyond the high windows. Not freedom necessarily, but what would make things better? What would make you feel more respected, more seen? The elves exchanged glances. Then Polly spoke carefully, as though testing the words. Is being nice if wizards is asking sometimes instead of ordering? Is being nice if work is being appreciated, not just expected? Is being nice if house elves is having some choice, not in whether to work, but in how work is being done? And perhaps, Winky added softly, is being nice if house elves who is wanting to leave could leave, without being shamed, without being cast out with nowhere to go? Is being nice if abuse is having consequences, said another elf, older, with scars on his arms that spoke of past cruelty. If Master is being cruel, if Master is hurting elf, there should be being something, some protection, some justice. Hermione nodded, her mind already working through the implications, through how these simple requests might be translated into legislation that could actually pass, that could actually help. What about wages? She asked, thinking of Dobby. Several elves looked uncomfortable. Some is wanting wages, Polly said diplomatically. Dobby is wanting wages, but most house elves is not needing money, is being provided for by families, by Hogwarts, is being cared for. But having the choice would matter, Hermione said. Even if you chose not to take wages, having the choice itself would mean something. Yes, Polly agreed. Choice is mattering very much. As the conversation wound down and the elves returned to preparing dinner for the students above, Hermione felt a shift in her understanding that was both profound and humbling. She had been so certain all those years ago that she knew what house elves needed, and she had been both right and wrong in ways she was only now beginning to understand. Creacher stood as she did, preparing to leave. But before they reached the portrait, Polly approached again, carrying something wrapped in a clean cloth. For Creacher, she said, holding it out. Fresh rolls, still warm, for taking home. Creacher accepted the bundle with a dignity that brought tears to Hermione's eyes. For a moment, the two house elves simply looked at each other, old and young, from different worlds, but the same struggle. Thank you, Creacher said softly, for speaking truth to Miss Granger, for being brave. Thank you, Polly replied, for helping her to listen. They walked back through the castle in comfortable silence, Hermione's mind full of everything she had heard, everything she needed to remember. Beside her, Creacher clutched his bundle of bread, and she thought she saw something in his expression that might have been peace. At the entrance hall, as they prepared to leave Hogwarts, Hermione turned to him. Thank you for bringing me here, for showing me this. Miss Granger is needing to see, Creacher said simply, is needing to understand that work is not the problem. Cruelty is the problem. Powerlessness is the problem. Invisibility is the problem. I understand now, Hermione said. I really do, and I'll do better, I promise. As they stepped out into the winter afternoon, snow beginning to fall in soft flakes that caught the last of the daylight, Hermione felt the weight of what she had undertaken settle more heavily on her shoulders. But it was a good weight, a necessary one, and she was no longer carrying it alone. The entrance to Gringotts looked the same as it always had, imposing, white marble, bronze doors gleaming in the early spring sunlight, goblin guards flanking the entrance with their customary watchfulness. But Hermione felt her stomach tighten as she and Creacher approached, the weight of official ministry documents in her satchel, doing little to ease her nervousness. It had taken 3 months to obtain the proper clearances, 3 months of careful paperwork, of meetings with suspicious department heads, of framing her request in just the right way. She was researching protective enchantments used by Death Eaters, she had said, documenting the full extent of dark magic artifacts for historical purposes, understanding how Voldemort's followers had hidden evidence of their crimes, all of which was true after a fashion. The fact that she was particularly interested in one vault, that she suspected it might contain research notes rather than cursed objects, that a house elf would be accompanying her. These details she had mentioned only when absolutely necessary and always carefully couched in official language. Miss Granger is certain about this, Creacher asked quietly as they climbed the steps. He was concealed beneath a travelling cloak that Hermione had transfigured to better fit him, his features hidden in shadow. Gringotts had rules about house elves in the bank, and neither of them wanted to draw unnecessary attention. As certain as I can be, Hermione replied. We have authorization. We're doing nothing wrong. We're just being thorough. Creacher made a sound that might have been skepticism. Inside, The great hall of Gringotts stretched before them, all marble and gold and the echoing sounds of commerce. Hermione approached the nearest available goblin, presenting her credentials with hands that she willed not to shake. The goblin examined the papers with the kind of thoroughness that suggested he suspected forgery. But finally, with a curt nod, he gestured to another goblin. "Griphook will escort you to the Lestrange vault. You have 2 hours. Any items removed must be documented and approved. Any curses triggered will result in immediate expulsion and revocation of access." "I understand," Hermione said. Griphook led them through the bank and down into the earth, the cart rattling along tracks that plunged into darkness and cold. Hermione had made this journey before, during the war, under very different circumstances. The memory of that desperate break-in made her current authorized visit feel almost surreal. Creacher sat beside her in silence, his gloved hands clutching the edge of the cart. If he was frightened, he showed no sign of it, but Hermione knew him well enough now to recognize the tension in his shoulders. The Lestrange vault, when they finally reached it, looked smaller than Hermione remembered. The Ministry had indeed cleared it. Gone were the multiplying treasures, the cursed goblets and charmed suits of armor. What remained was still impressive. Ancient furniture, paintings in heavy frames, chests of old documents, shelves of books that looked as though they hadn't been touched in decades, and everywhere the lingering sense of dark magic, like a bitter taste in the air. 2 hours, Griphook reminded them, and withdrew to wait by the cart. Hermione and Creacher stood at the entrance for a moment, taking in the scope of what they needed to search. 2 hours was not very long. "Master Regulus is being clever about hiding things," Creacher said finally. "Is making important things look unimportant. Is using protection spells that is looking like other spells." He moved forward slowly, his eyes scanning the vault's contents with the intensity of someone reading a familiar language. "There is being too many books on that shelf, is not matching the dust patterns." Hermione looked where he was pointing. The shelf did indeed seem oddly crowded on one end, books jammed together in a way that suggested they had been added later, hastily. They approached carefully. Hermione had brought protective equipment, dragon hide gloves, a wand at the ready, detection charms prepared. But Creacher simply reached out and touched the spine of one book with a single, gnarled finger. "Is here," he said softly. "Creacher is feeling Master Regulus's magic. Very faint, very old, but is here." He pulled the book, a thick volume on medieval curse breaking, from the shelf, and behind it, tucked into the gap, was a small locket-shaped box made of tarnished silver. Hermione's breath caught. "Is not being a Horcrux," Creacher said quickly. "Creacher is knowing Horcruxes. This is being something different, but is being protected like one. Master Regulus is learning from his mistakes," Creacher is thinking, "is making this very hard to find." He set the box on a nearby table with great care. Hermione could see the protective enchantments now, shimmering faintly around it. Layers of magic meant to deter, to deceive, to destroy anyone who opened it incorrectly. "Can you open it?" she asked. Creacher is thinking so. Master Regulus is teaching Creacher many things before he is dying, including how to recognize his protections. Creacher studied the box, his expression distant. But Miss Granger should be standing back. If Creacher is wrong... Hermione stepped back, but kept her wand ready. protective charms on the tip of her tongue. Creacher spoke a word in what sounded like Old English, then another in a language Hermione didn't recognize at all. His fingers traced patterns in the air above the box, delicate and precise. The protective enchantments flickered, shifted, began to unravel, and then, with a soft click, the box opened. Inside, wrapped in cloth that had once been white but had yellowed with age, were papers. Parchment covered in Regulus's familiar handwriting. The ink faded but still legible. Hermione leaned closer, careful not to touch, and began to read. The notes were fragmentary, clearly written in haste and under stress. But even in their incomplete state, they were extraordinary. Regulus had been documenting everything he could discover about Horcruxes, not just how to create them, but the magical theory underlying them, the cost of soul splitting, the way such dark magic corrupted everything it touched. And woven through it all was his fascination with house elf magic. The Dark Lord asks how house elves can bind themselves so completely to service without losing their identity, one passage read. He sees it as a puzzle, something to be solved and exploited. But he misses the essential point. House elves choose their loyalty, even when that choice is constrained. They give service while retaining self. A Horcrux is the opposite. The self is fractured, diminished. He tears himself apart while they remain whole. I wonder if this is why he fears house elves, though he would never admit it. They possess something he destroyed in himself, the capacity for loyalty that is chosen rather than compelled. 4. Love that survives even the harshest binding. Hermione felt tears prickling at her eyes. He understood, she whispered. He really understood. Master Regulus is being complicated, Creacher said, his voice rough. Is making terrible choices, is following the Dark Lord, is believing in blood purity. But at the end, is seeing what is really mattering, is seeing that love is being stronger than power, that loyalty is being stronger than compulsion. They went through the papers together, reading quickly but carefully. There were notes on the protections around each Horcrux, theories about where they might be hidden. Much of this had been rendered moot by the war's end. All the Horcruxes had been destroyed, but the theoretical work was still valuable, still illuminating. And then, near the bottom of the stack, Hermione found something that made her freeze. A diagram, complex, intricate, showing the magical bonds between a house elf and a wizarding family, but where the bonds should have been one-directional, magic flowing from elf to master, binding the elf into service. Regulus had drawn them as reciprocal. Beside the diagram, he had written, "What if the binding goes both ways? What if masters are as bound to their house elves as the elves are to them? But we have simply never acknowledged it. The magic of a house requires maintenance, requires care. Without house elves, these old families would crumble. They need the elves as much as the elves need them, perhaps more." "Is this true?" Hermione asked, pointing to the diagram. "Are wizarding families actually dependent on house elf magic?" Creacher studied the parchment for a long moment. Creacher is never thinking of it this way, but is being possible. Old houses is being held together by house elf magic. Protections is being maintained by house elves. Traditions is being preserved by house elves. Without house elves, many pure-blood families is losing what is making them powerful. "So it's not slavery," Hermione said slowly, working through the implications. Or not just slavery. It's symbiosis. Unequal, unfair, but still, both sides need each other. Is why freeing house elves is sometimes being cruel, Creacher said quietly. Is why Dobby is struggling so much before finding work with Dumbledore. Is not just losing family, is losing the magic that is sustaining them, the purpose that is giving them identity. Hermione sat back, her mind reeling. This changed everything. Not the moral imperative. House elves still deserved rights, protection, choice. But the approach. You couldn't simply break the bonds. You had to transform them. Make them fair. Make them mutual. Make them acknowledged. She was about to say as much when Creacher suddenly stiffened. Miss Granger should be stepping back. Now. The urgency in his voice made her move without question. She scrambled backward, just as one of the protective enchantments on the box flared to life. Residual magic triggered by their handling of the contents. Dark energy crackled through the air, seeking a target. Creacher threw himself in front of Hermione, his arms spread wide, and the magic struck him full in the chest. He went down hard. Creacher! Hermione dropped to her knees beside him, her hands hovering over his body, afraid to touch him, afraid not to. Creacher, can you hear me? His eyes fluttered open. Creacher is being all right, is being stupid, should be noticing the delayed trigger. You shielded me, Hermione said, her voice shaking. You didn't have to. Miss Granger is being Creacher's friend, Creacher said simply, as though that explained everything. And perhaps it did. It's Creacher's choice to protect friend. The word hung between them, friend, and Hermione felt something shift in her chest, something warm and fierce and grateful. We need to get you checked, she said, helping him sit up carefully. Make sure there's no lasting damage. Creacher is being fine. But Miss Granger is being right that we should be leaving soon, is finding what we is coming for. They gathered the papers carefully, documenting each piece as the goblins had required, noting them as research materials related to dark magic theory. Not technically a lie. They restored the box to its shelf, left the vault as undisturbed as possible. Only when they were back in the card, rising toward the surface, did Hermione allow herself to fully process what had happened. Creacher had protected her, had chosen freely and deliberately to put himself between her and harm, just as Regulus had chosen to protect Creacher. The pattern of it struck her with sudden clarity. How choice transformed everything, how loyalty freely given was a kind of magic more powerful than any compulsion. They emerged into the spring sunlight, and Hermione took a deep breath of fresh air, grateful to be out of the cold depths of Gringotts. Beside her, Creacher straightened his cloak, his expression carefully neutral. Thank you, Hermione said quietly, for protecting me, for trusting me with this. Miss Granger is being worthy of trust, Creacher replied, is being worthy of Master Regulus's hopes. They walked down the steps of Gringotts together, the precious documents safe in Hermione's satchel, and Hermione thought about the long road still ahead, the legislation to write, the minds to change, the systems to transform. But they were not walking that road alone anymore. They had each other. They had Regulus's research. They had the truth. And sometimes she was learning. That was enough to begin with. The Wizengamot chamber was exactly as intimidating as Hermione remembered. All soaring ceilings and dark wood paneling. Rows of seats rising in tiers around a central floor, where those being questioned or presenting proposals stood exposed to scrutiny from every angle. The spring sunlight filtered through high windows, casting long shadows that seemed to emphasize the weight of history and tradition pressing down on the room. Hermione stood at the speaker's podium, her carefully prepared notes spread before her, and tried to steady her breathing. She had spent weeks preparing for this moment, refining her arguments, anticipating objections, gathering evidence. But now, facing the assembled members of the Wizengamot, some sympathetic, many skeptical, a few openly hostile, she felt the old nervousness threatening to overwhelm her. In the visitors' gallery above, Harry and Ron sat watching. Their presence helped, but it was the small figure seated quietly in the shadows at the edge of the room that steadied her most. Creacher had come, though she had not asked him to. He sat perfectly still, nearly invisible in his formal robes. Not a tea towel now, but proper clothing that he had accepted from Harry with quiet dignity. He was here to listen, he had said, to witness. But Hermione suspected he might be here for more than that. The chief warlock, a stern witch named Arabella Marchbanks, who had survived both wars and countless political upheavals, called the session to order with a sharp rap of her gavel. The chair recognizes Miss Hermione Granger, representing the Department for the Regulation and Control of Magical Creatures, to present proposed amendments to the House Elf Welfare Act of 1823. Hermione cleared her throat. Thank you, Chief Warlock. Honored members of the Wizengamot, I come before you today not to overturn tradition, but to strengthen it, not to diminish our magical heritage, but to honor the beings who have helped preserve it for centuries. She saw a few members shift in their seats. Good. She had their attention, at least. The current laws governing house elves were written nearly 200 years ago, in a very different time. They provide no protection against abuse, no recourse for elves who are mistreated, no mechanism for choice or consent in their service. I propose we update these laws not to free all house elves, as I once believed was necessary, but to grant them fundamental protections and dignities. She outlined her proposals clearly, methodically. Protection from physical abuse with magical enforcement. The option, not the requirement, of wages for those who desired them. The ability to leave a household that was cruel without being cast out, homeless and broken. The recognition that house elves were sentient beings deserving of basic rights. As she spoke, she saw reactions rippling through the chamber. Some members nodded thoughtfully, others frowned. A wizard in the third row, Cornelius Knott, from an old pure-blood family, was openly scowling. When she finished her initial presentation, Chief Warlock Marchbanks opened the floor for questions. They came rapidly, some genuine, and some clearly designed to undermine her position. Miss Granger, said a witch from the second tier, her tone polite but sharp. You speak of protections against abuse, but house elves are magically bound to serve their families. This binding has existed for millennia. Are you proposing we somehow break or alter fundamental magical bonds? Not break them, Hermione replied. Transform them. The research I've conducted, including examination of historical records from several old families, suggests that these bonds vary in their strictness. Some allow for more autonomy than others. I propose we establish minimum standards for these bonds, ensuring they include protections for the elf. And who would enforce such standards? Demanded Cornelius Knott. Would you have the ministry interfering in the private affairs of ancient families, inspecting our homes, questioning our treatment of our own servants? I would have the ministry protecting vulnerable beings from harm, Hermione said steadily. Just as we protect children, just as we protect any wizard or witch who cannot protect themselves, this is not about interference. It's about basic decency. Basic decency, not sneered. From a muggle-born who understands nothing of our traditions, our heritage. Mr. Knott, Chief Warlock Marchbanks, interrupted sharply. We will maintain civility in this chamber. Miss Granger's blood status has no bearing on the merits of her proposal. But the damage was done. Hermione could see other pure blood members shifting, their expressions hardening. This was the obstacle she had known she would face, the assumption that as a muggle-born, she couldn't possibly understand the complexities of magical tradition, the sacred bonds between old families and their house elves. She was preparing her next argument when a voice spoke from the shadows at the edge of the room. Creacher is wishing to speak. The entire chamber fell silent. Heads turned toward the source of the voice. Creacher stood slowly, stepping forward into the light, his ancient face solemn. Chief Warlock Marchbanks looked startled. A house elf wishes to address the Wizengamot. If the Wizengamot is being willing to listen, Creacher said, his voice carrying clearly through the suddenly quiet chamber. Creacher is being a black family house elf, is serving the noble and most ancient house of black for many generations, is knowing something of tradition and heritage. Marchbanks exchanged glances with the other senior members. This was unprecedented, but finally, with visible curiosity, she nodded. The Wizengamot recognizes Creacher of the House of Black. Creacher moved to stand beside Hermione at the podium. Up close, she could see his hands trembling slightly, but his voice remained steady as he began to speak. Creacher is serving the Black family, since Creacher is very young, is serving Master Orion and Mistress Walburga, is serving Master Sirius, though Master Sirius is not wanting Creature's service, and is serving Master Regulus. At the mention of Regulus Black, several of the older pure blood members leaned forward with interest. Regulus was a name that still carried weight in these circles, a pure blood who had died in service to the Dark Lord, or so most believed. Master Regulus is being brave, Creacher continued, his voice softening. Is being very brave, is discovering a terrible secret about the Dark Lord, is finding one of the Dark Lord's Horcruxes, a locket containing a piece of the Dark Lord's soul, and is trying to destroy it. Murmurs rippled through the chamber. This was not a story most of them knew. The Dark Lord is using Creacher to test protections around the Horcrux, is taking Creacher to a cave, is making Creacher drink terrible potion, is leaving Creacher to die. But Master Regulus is saving Creacher, is ordering Creacher to leave the cave, to take the locket, to destroy it, and to tell no one what is happening. Creature's voice grew rougher. Master Regulus is dying in that cave so Creacher could live, is choosing to protect his house elf instead of saving himself. And before he is dying, Master Regulus is writing Creacher a letter. He withdrew the worn parchment from his robes, handling it with the reverence of a sacred object. In this letter, Master Regulus is saying house elves is deserving better, is saying the house elf question should not be a question, because we is being people, not problems, is saying He is sorry for not seeing this sooner. The chamber was completely silent now. Even Cornelius Knott had stopped scowling, his expression arrested somewhere between skepticism and unwilling respect. "Master Regulus is dying with honor," Creacher said, and there was steel in his voice now. "Is dying trying to destroy the Dark Lord, is dying to protect Creacher. And in his memory, Creacher is standing here today to say that Miss Granger is being right." He turned to look at the assembled Wizengamot, his enormous eyes sweeping across their faces. "House elves is not wanting to be freed. Not all of us. Creature is not wanting freedom. But house elves is wanting to be seen, is wanting to be protected from cruelty, is wanting choice, not in whether to serve, but in how we is serving and who we is serving." His voice dropped lower, more intense. "Master Regulus is understanding this, is understanding that loyalty given freely is being stronger than loyalty compelled. That service with dignity is being honor, but service with abuse is being shame. Shame on the master, not the elf." Creature paused, and when he spoke again, his words fell like stones into still water. "There is being an old pureblood tradition, very old, a tradition saying that a house elf's testimony about their master's character is being unimpeachable. House elves is not lying about their masters, is not possible. The magic of the binding is making it so." Hermione saw several of the older Wizengamot members nodding slowly. This was true. She had found references to this tradition in her research, though she hadn't been certain how seriously it was still taken. "So Creature is testifying now," Creacher said, his voice ringing with quiet authority. "Is testifying that Master Regulus Black, son of Orion and Walburga, heir to the noble and most ancient house of Black, is dying with honor, is dying believing that house elves is deserving dignity and protection, is dying believing that the old ways is needing to change, not to destroy tradition, but to make it worthy of respect." He looked directly at Cornelius Knott. "Master Regulus is being as pure blood as any wizard in this chamber, is being raised in tradition and heritage, and Master Regulus is seeing that tradition without compassion is being empty, that heritage without honor is being worthless." The silence that followed was profound. Hermione could see the impact of Creature's words on the assembled witches and wizards, particularly the pure blood families who still held to the old traditions. A house elf's testimony was, indeed, considered unimpeachable. And Creature had just invoked one of their most respected sons to support her cause. Finally, Chief Warlock Marchbank spoke. "Thank you, Creature of the House of Black. Your testimony will be noted in the official record." She looked out over the chamber. "Are there further questions for Miss Granger?" The questions that followed were different in tone, more thoughtful, less hostile. Hermione answered them as best she could, but she was aware that the real argument had already been made, and not by her. When the session finally concluded, Marchbanks announced that the Wizengamot would deliberate and vote at their next meeting, 1 week hence. The chamber began to empty, members gathering in small groups to discuss what they had heard. Hermione turned to Creature, emotion threatening to overwhelm her carefully maintained composure. "You didn't have to do that. I never asked you to." "Creature is knowing Miss Granger is not asking," Creature said quietly. "Is why Creature is doing it, is being Creature's choice, is being what Master Regulus would be wanting." Harry and Ron had made their way down from the gallery, and Harry clasped Creacher's shoulder with obvious pride. "That was brilliant, Creacher. Really brilliant." "Master Harry is being kind," Creacher said, but Hermione could see the pleasure in his expression, carefully hidden, but there nonetheless. As they left the chamber together, an elderly witch approached them. She had been sitting in the front row of the Wizengamot, and Hermione recognized her as Augusta Longbottom, Neville's grandmother. "Miss Granger," she said, her voice crisp but not unkind, "that was a well-argued proposal. And you," she turned to Creacher, spoke with great dignity. "My family's house elves have served us for generations. I had not considered that we might owe them more than we have given. You have given me much to think about." She nodded once and swept away, leaving Hermione staring after her in surprise. "That's Augusta Longbottom," Ron whispered. "If you've got her thinking, you might actually have a chance." Over the next week, Hermione waited with growing anxiety for the Wizengamot's decision. She returned to her small office, to her files and research, but found it difficult to focus. The proposals she had made represented months of work, of learning, of transformation in her own understanding. And Creacher's testimony had been so powerful, so unexpected, that she hardly dared hope it might be enough. Creacher visited her office twice during that week, bringing tea and quiet companionship. They didn't speak much about the upcoming vote. Instead, they talked about other things, about Hogwarts, about the changes they had seen in the wizarding world since the war, about small hopes and careful dreams. On the morning of the vote, Hermione dressed with particular care and arrived at the ministry early. The Wizengamot chamber was even more crowded than before, word having spread about the unusual nature of the proposal and the house elf's testimony. When Chief Warlock Marchbanks called for the vote, Hermione held her breath. The legislation did not pass in its entirety. The Wizengamot was not ready for such sweeping change, but what did pass was more than Hermione had dared to hope for. Protection against physical abuse, with enforceable penalties for masters who harmed their house elves. The right to appeal to the ministry in cases of extreme cruelty. The option, carefully worded, heavily caveated, but present nonetheless, for house elves to accept wages if both elf and master agreed. It was a beginning, a small one perhaps, but a beginning nonetheless. As the chamber emptied, Augusta Longbottom approached Hermione again. "The Longbottom family will be implementing these protections immediately," she said, "and I suspect others will follow. You have done good work here, Miss Granger, and your associate." She glanced at Creacher with something that might have been respect. "Has reminded us that honor demands more than tradition, demands decency." That evening, Hermione and Creacher sat in her office at the ministry, sharing tea as had become their custom. Outside, spring was deepening into early summer, the days growing longer, the world slowly healing from wounds both seen and unseen. "Master Regulus would be proud," Creacher said softly, staring into his teacup. "Is being what he is wanting, change, progress, but with respect for what is being good in the old ways." "You honored him," Hermione said, "better than any monument or memorial could have done. You made his dreams real." Creacher nodded slowly, and for the first time since she had known him, Hermione saw him smile, a small, careful expression, but genuine. "Is being beginning," he said. "Is being much work still to do, but is being good beginning?" "Yes," Hermione agreed, raising her teacup in a small salute. It is. And in the quiet of that small office, witch and house elf sat together, drinking tea and planning tomorrow's work, bound not by magic or compulsion, but by friendship and the shared conviction that the world could be better than it had been, that it must be better, and that together they would make it so. Summer had come to London with unusual gentleness, bringing long golden evenings and the scent of blooming flowers drifting through open windows. At number 12, Grimmauld Place, the changes were subtle but unmistakable to those who knew where to look. The house felt lighter. It was not that the shadows had disappeared entirely. Old houses held their histories too deeply for that, but they no longer pressed down with quite the same weight. The portrait of Walburga Black still hung in the entrance hall, but her curtains remained closed more often than not, and when she did emerge to screech, her protests seemed more petulant than venomous. Even she, it seemed, had tired somewhat in the year since the war's end. In the kitchen, Creacher moved through the late afternoon routine of preparing dinner with practiced ease. But there were differences here too. The silver gleamed. The floors had been scrubbed until the old stone showed its true color. Fresh herbs grew in pots on the windowsill, basil and thyme catching the sunlight. The room smelled of roasting chicken and rising bread, warm and welcoming in a way it had not been for decades. Creacher paused in his work, looking around the kitchen with an expression that might have been satisfaction. This was his domain, had always been his domain, but now it felt like something more, like a home he had chosen rather than a prison he was bound to. The front door opened upstairs. Creacher's ears swiveled toward the sound. Master Harry, right on time. Harry appeared in the kitchen doorway a moment later, still in his aura trainee robes, looking tired but more settled in himself than he had been even a few months ago. The haunted quality that had clung to him after the war was fading, replaced by something steadier, calmer. "Smells amazing, Creacher," Harry said, crossing to the sink to wash his hands. He did this now without being asked, had learned the rhythms of Creacher's kitchen and moved through them with respect. "Hermione's coming for dinner, right?" "Miss Granger is arriving at 7, Creacher confirmed. "Is Master Harry wanting to help with the table?" It had become a ritual between them, this small sharing of domestic tasks. Harry was not much good at cooking, had never been taught, had spent too many years in cupboards and with Dursleys to learn properly. But he could set a table, could pour wine, could participate in the making of a meal, even if he could not make the meal itself. "Sure," Harry said, and began pulling plates from the cabinet. They worked in companionable silence for a while, Harry laying out settings for 3, while Creacher checked the chicken and stirred the pot of potatoes simmering on the stove. The kitchen windows were open to the summer evening, and distantly they could hear the sounds of Muggle London going about its business. "How was training?" Creacher asked eventually. "Exhausting. Moody's replacement, Dawlish, had us practicing defensive spells for 6 hours straight." Harry flexed his wand hand, wincing slightly. "But good. It's good to be doing something useful." "Master Harry is always being useful," Creacher said, not looking up from his work. "Yeah, well, sometimes it's nice to feel useful at something that doesn't involve nearly dying." Creacher made a sound that might have been agreement or amusement, or both. At precisely 7 o'clock, the flue chimed, and Hermione stepped through into the parlor, brushing ash from her robes. She made her way to the kitchen with the ease of someone who had made this journey many times, carrying a bottle of wine and a folder of papers that suggested she had come directly from work. "Sorry, I'm a bit late," she said, setting both on the table. "Last-minute meeting about the house elf registry. Revisions." "Is being progress?" Creacher asked, pulling the chicken from the oven. "Slow progress, but progress." Hermione smiled at him, warm and genuine. 3 more families have registered their house elves under the new protections this week, including the Parkinsons, which I didn't expect. "The Parkinsons is being traditional," Creacher observed, beginning to carve the chicken with practiced efficiency. "But is not being stupid, is seeing which way the wind is blowing." They settled around the table, Harry at the head, Hermione to his right, and Creacher, after only a moment's hesitation, taking the seat to Harry's left. This too had been a gradual change. For months, Creacher had refused to sit with them, had insisted on serving and then retreating to eat alone in his cupboard. But slowly, carefully, they had worn down his resistance. Now he sat with them more often than not, though he still insisted on doing most of the serving himself. The food was excellent, as Creature's cooking always was. They ate and talked, the conversation flowing easily around the table. Harry shared stories from Aura training, the absurdities and challenges of learning proper investigative procedure after years of simply improvising. Hermione talked about the ministry, about the slow grinding work of reform, about small victories and persistent obstacles. And Creacher, prompted by gentle questions, spoke of his own quiet triumphs, of the letter he had received from Winky at Hogwarts, thanking him for his testimony before the Wizengamot, telling him that the Hogwarts house elves had begun to organize themselves to discuss their conditions and their wishes, of the young house elf from a minor pure-blood family who had appeared in the Grimmauld Place kitchen, asking for advice, wanting to learn to read as Creacher had learned. "You're teaching house elves to read?" Harry asked, looking surprised and pleased. "Is being only 2 so far," Creacher said, almost defensively. "Young uns wanting to learn. Creacher is remembering how Master Regulus is teaching him, is passing this on." "That's wonderful," Hermione said softly. "That's exactly the kind of change that matters. Not just laws, but house elves empowering each other, sharing knowledge." Creacher ducked his head, uncomfortable with the praise, but clearly pleased. As the meal wound down and Harry began clearing plates, Creacher had finally, grudgingly, allowed this. Hermione pulled a folded piece of parchment from her folder. "There's something I wanted to show you both," she said. "It's just a draft, nothing official yet, but—" She unfolded the parchment, revealing a sketch. "I've been working with a designer on a memorial for house elves who died in the wars, both wars, all the way back. The design was simple but powerful, a standing stone with names inscribed, house elves depicted not as cowering servants, but as dignified figures. And at the top, 2 names that would be listed first, Dobby and Regulus Black. A house elf and a wizard," Hermione explained, both of whom understood that loyalty and freedom aren't opposites, that choice and service can coexist, that love matters more than power. Creacher stared at the sketch for a long moment, his eyes suddenly very bright. When he spoke, his voice was rough. Master Regulus would be liking this, would be thinking it is being fitting. Do you like it? Hermione asked gently. Creacher is thinking it is being right, is being proper memorial, is honoring both what was lost and what was learned. He paused. Is there being a place for it? I was thinking the ministry, Hermione said. In the atrium, where everyone who enters will see it, where house elves and wizards alike will walk past it every day and remember. Harry reached out and squeezed Creacher's shoulder gently. I think it's brilliant, and I think you should be there when it's unveiled, front and center. Creacher is not needing. You deserve to be recognized, Harry said firmly, for everything you did during the war, for everything you're doing now. You're a hero, Creacher, whether you want to admit it or not. Creacher made a grumbling sound that might have been protest or might have been embarrassed pleasure, but he didn't argue further. They moved from the kitchen to the sitting room, where Creacher had laid a fire despite the summer warmth. There was something comforting about it, something that spoke of permanence and home. They settled into the old but now well-maintained furniture, glasses of wine in hand, and simply sat together in comfortable silence. After a while, Creacher rose and crossed to the mantelpiece. He withdrew something from behind the clock, the sketch Regulus had drawn all those years ago, the house elf standing proud and free. He had framed it, Hermione saw. Simple frame, but well-made, protective glass, keeping the fragile parchment safe. Master Regulus is drawing this before he is dying, Creacher said quietly, holding it so they both could see. Is drawing how he is wanting things to be. And now, he gestured around the room at the three of them sitting together, at the clean and cared-for house, at the evidence of choice and friendship and mutual respect. Now is being closer to his dream. Not just his dream, Hermione said. Yours too. You made this happen, Creacher. You and your courage. Is being all of us together, Creacher corrected. Creacher is not doing this alone. Master Harry is giving Creacher freedom to choose. Miss Granger is listening and learning, is being partnership, not just one person. He returned the sketch to its place of honor on the mantel, and then did something that surprised both Harry and Hermione. From his robes, he withdrew Regulus's letter, the one that had started everything, and placed it beside the sketch. Is being time to stop hiding these things, he said. Is being time to remember Master Regulus not in secret, but in the open. Is being time to honor his memory properly. He'd be proud of you, Harry said quietly. Really, really proud. They sat by the fire as the summer evening deepened into night, talking and sometimes not talking, simply being together in the quiet warmth of a house that had finally, after so many years, become a home. At some point, the conversation turned to the future, to Hermione's plans for further reforms, incremental but important, to Harry's hopes for the aura department, for justice that was fair rather than merely harsh, to Creacher's quiet dream of a world where house elves could choose their service, could take pride in their work without being diminished by it. Is being strange, Creacher said eventually, staring into the fire. Creacher is being old, is serving the House of Black for longer than Master Harry, and Miss Granger is being alive, and now everything is changing, is being frightening sometimes. But good frightening? Hermione asked gently. Creacher considered this. Is being frightening, like standing at the edge of something new, not knowing what is coming, but knowing Is being necessary? Is being what Master Regulus is feeling, Creacher is thinking, in that cave? Frightened but certain, scared but right. You don't have to be scared alone anymore, Harry said. That's the difference. Whatever comes next, we're in it together. Creacher looked at them both, these two young people who had, against all odds and contrary to all expectations, become his friends, his family, in all the ways that mattered. Yes, he said softly, together. The fire burned steadily, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Outside, London settled into its nighttime rhythms, and inside, number 12, Grimmauld Place, 3 unlikely companions sat together, bound not by magic or obligation, but by choice and friendship, and the shared conviction that the world was better than it had been, and could be better still. Creacher thought of Regulus, as he often did, but tonight the memory brought no pain, only a gentle warmth, a sense of promise kept and duty fulfilled. Master Regulus had hoped for change, had died believing it was possible, and Creacher, old and stubborn and surprisingly resilient, had made that hope real. The fire still burned, the work continued, the story went on, and that, Creacher thought, was exactly as it should be. In the kitchen, the dishes washed themselves with a whisper of house elf magic. Upstairs, the portrait of Walburga Black slept behind her curtains, her protests exhausted for the night. And in the sitting room, beside the fire that would burn through the night, 3 friends talked and laughed and planned tomorrow's work. The House of Black had endured much, had seen glory and shame, triumph and tragedy, countless generations of pride and prejudice and power. But tonight, for the first time in longer than anyone could remember, it was something more. It was a home. And Creacher, house elf of the noble and most ancient house of Black, keeper of memories and guardian of dreams, had finally found his redemption. Not in grand gestures or dramatic sacrifices, but in the quiet, persistent choice to make each day a little better than the last, to honor those who had been lost by building something worthy for those who remained, to remember the past while choosing the future, to serve with dignity, to love with wholeness, to remain always and forever himself. The fire crackled, the conversation continued, and summer deepened over London, gentle and warm and full of promise.